Hi there and welcome back to 355 Code. This is the first video in a tutorial where we will build a Karel interface. For those of you who are not familiar, what we have in front of us now is a Karel interface, and if you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see that the original Karel is an educational programming language created by Richard E. Pattis, and you can see that basically there is this robot that moves around. And we will be mimicking that with a dog that can take several commands, and it will visualize those commands over here on this grid. So for example, if we say Karel.move, Karel will move forward 1, and if we say Karel.turn right, then Karel will move forward 1 and turn right. And the language we're based off here is Javascript, so if we wanted, we could also create a loop. So we could say for let I equals 0, I smaller than 5, I plus plus, and then wrap that in parentheses. And then you can see that our dog goes around five times. And this basically can help somebody learn what a for loop is in a very visual way. So we're going to be working on that today. Today we'll really just be creating the basic Karel dog and seeing how we can place him on the grid. So what I have for you here in the starting code, I'm going to press run just so you can see what's included. So basically what I've done is I've just set up the grid. And it's also not complete yet because there is some work that we need to do behind the scenes to get this grid up and running. So how does this grid work? Basically, we have just a div that's the grid. This canvas we actually don't need at the moment. And that's pretty much all of the HTML. I'll run the code again just so you see we don't need that canvas. And I have some CSS set up here. So in the root, I have a dog image, which I've uploaded in advance. I've set the background color, and I've given some CSS styling to the grid. So the grid is this entire grid, and each box is defined with this box class. And it's just using CSS grid to set it up. I'm not going to dive into that too much. Here I've commented out some styles that we'll be using later on for Karel. And here in the JavaScript, I've selected the grid. I've given it some default sizes. And I've basically set it up visually using a class, which we'll talk about soon, and a loop that basically creates a lot of boxes and pushes them into the grid. And it's all done in this function called createBoard. So that's our starting point. And the first thing that I want to do together is really create our Karel, because that is the goal of this tutorial. And the way we're going to do that is in a similar way to what you see here, which is by creating a class for Karel. And this class will basically allow us to use certain predefined functions to change certain aspects of Karel, like you saw in the demonstration that I gave you before. So if you're not familiar, I'll briefly go over classes. So a class is like a template where we kind of give it attributes and functions. So properties and things that it can do, and then we basically can replicate that that class in specific elements or objects or whatever it might be. We're going to be using these classes to create HTML elements. Like you can see, I've done it already here for the for our grid box. And we're going to do that for Karel as well. And the reason that we're going to do that is, one, so that we can give it the predefined functions that we can execute on Karel. And also it'll make it easier to move Karel around, because basically the way it will work is that every time we move Karel, it's actually going to be a new Karel. Okay, so let's take a look at that right now together. So to create a class, we have to use this class keyword, and this class is going to be called Karel. Okay, and if we were just creating the class just like that, then we'd open parentheses here. But this class is actually a subclass, and basically what that means is that it's going to inherit some properties from another class, and that class is HTML element. So in order to do that, we need to write extends HTML element, and then we can start defining things within our class. So in order to give a class attributes, we need to use the constructor function. And within the constructor function, we are going to set up our attributes. For example, I can write this dot name equals Karel. Okay, just for example. And then every time that I create a new Karel object, its name will be Karel. We don't need this, of course, but what we do need to do is to use the super keyword, and that basically means that take everything from HTML element, all the attributes and functions, and super them into Karel. And what this allows us to do, for example, is to add a class list to Karel, because HTML elements already have this predefined method, which is a function that's built into the class. So HTML elements have this predefined function of .classlist.add. So we can use this now in our Karel class because we use this super keyword. Okay, and the way that we add attributes and functions and methods to this class is using the this keyword. So this, you could think of, is Karel, or every Karel that we will create, it will be this. So when I say this dot class list dot add, and what we're going to do here is add the class Karel, which I created here already in CSS. Okay, whoops, I want to uncomment that. So let me uncomment all of this, and then I will just recomment the ball, just to show that we're not using it yet. And you can see that for Karel, I've given it a height and a width that's dependent on the box size, right? Because we want it to fit it on inside of these boxes. It has a background image, which is up here, and z-index of 1, just so that it's always the top thing, because we want it to sit on top of the grid and also on top of other things that we might add in. So it's a pretty simple layout. And the next thing that I want to show you is how to add a method or a function to this Karel. So in order to do that, okay, you just have to declare the function under the constructor. So for example, let's say we want to define a function that will bark. Okay, so let's say I say bark, and this function will basically just console.log bark. Okay, and now what I want to do is to create a new Karel. Okay, so what I'm going to do here on the bottom of our JavaScript is I'm going to say const Karel. Okay, so I'm creating a variable, and that variable will be equal to a new Karel. And you have to add parentheses. Okay, and then what I want to do under here is Karel dot bark. Okay, and now let's run our code. Type our illegal constructor. So let's see where our mistake is. 15. Okay, so one thing that I want to try and do is, as you see here, when we are making a custom HTML element, we also need to define it within our custom elements. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to define Karel dog, and note that this has to be separated by a hyphen. Okay, it can't just be one word. And this is going to be defined using our Karel class. Okay, and I just want to run the code to see, yeah, so that was our problem. Okay, this is something special that you only need to do for classes that are extending HTML element because you're basically creating a custom element and you need to define it so that if we add this element to our HTML, then you will have a way to identify it. So let me show you what I mean. So here I showed you how to create the new Karel and then how to make it bark. So you can see in console.log it says bark because we basically use this method. What I want to do now is show you how we can append this Karel to our body. So what I'm going to do here is document.body.append, and I'm going to append Karel, okay, which is this new HTML element that we created. And I'm going to run our code, and where is Karel? Okay, I just want to make sure that he's not hiding under somewhere here. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and append him to the grid. Let's try running the code again, and boom. Okay, so you can see here that our Karel dog popped up on top of the grid. And if we take a look behind the scenes here, so I'm going to use here the inspect. Yeah, so these are our errors from before. And if we look here at the HTML layout of our page, then you can see here that within our grid, okay, so we have a lot of these grid boxes. And if I scroll all the way down, we have a Karel dog, okay? And this is a custom HTML element, so Karel dogs are not usually HTML tags that you can use, but because we defined it as a custom element, then we can add it to our screen. So I'm gonna erase this bark because we don't need it. But as you can see, we already created our Karel and we already attached it to the grid, so that's great progress. One thing that I want to define for this Karel is its direction. So what we're going to do is say this dot direction equals east. So we're going to use north, south, west, and east as our directions, and right will be relative to Karel. So if we say turn right, then it'll turn right relative to itself, but east north, south, east, west will always stay the same, and I think that that is a good way to do the orientation of things. So what we can do here is if we want to just tap into this direction, then we can say, for example, here, instead of carol.bark, we can say console.log carol.direction. Okay, and then it'll give us east. Okay, so this will be helpful later on because we're going to want to know sometimes which way Karel is facing in order to tell it what to do in certain situations. Okay, and now I want to go and define the first method together, and that will be a method called place. Okay, and this method will basically put Karel in a certain square. Okay, and what we're going to be giving it is, let's say, a location. Okay, and then based on that location, it will put Karel in a certain square. But in order to do that, we will first need to create a way to identify each grid box individually so that we can pick a specific location to attach the Karel to. Because now we just attached him to the general grid, and he happens to be here in the upper left corner, but he's not really in a specific box. And that's something that we're going to want to do also to have that ability and also to start off our game. So let me just show you what that will look like in the end, in our final version. So let's say I say Karel.place, and let's say I say 5, 6. Okay, and then I run the code. You could see Karel jumped to the 5th row and the 6th column. Okay, so actually here, in order to make that more clear, let's actually use row and column. Okay, because it's going to take two. Arguments. Okay. Great. So let's backtrack a bit and head to our grid boxes. So what we're going to need to do is that when we are setting up our grid boxes, we are going to want to give them an ID of some sort. And this ID will basically determine where they are, or indicate where they are on this larger grid box. And the way we're going to do that is that here, when we're creating our board, okay, while we're running this loop, okay, which sets up our boxes, we are going to want to we're going to want to set an ID. Okay, and this ID, okay, will be made up of, it'll be an array, this ID property, and it'll have a row and a column. Okay, so basically as we're setting up our grid, we're going to need a way to figure out if this is what row and what column we're in. Okay, so let's say that we just define, let's say out here we'll say let row equal 1. Okay, because we're starting in row 1, and then as we create our as we create our boxes, we are going to be in row 1, okay, until something happens. And what is that thing? It's then when we get to the box that is in the last column, okay? And for that, we're also going to want to have our column. So let's say column will also be equal to 1. And as we place the boxes, each time we place a box, because we're placing them from left to right, that just has to do with how Gridbox works. Then we will, CSS Grid works. And so basically each time we put out one of these boxes, we will want to increment column by 1. Okay, so we'll do that after we append the box. Let's just say column plus plus. Okay, so now as we move along, each time the column will increase by 1. But if this column, if this column is equal to our grid size, if you take a look up here, what's grid size? It's 10. So grid size basically tells us how much by how much our grid is going to be. So here it's a 10 by 10 grid because I set grid size to 10. If I was to set it to 20, it would be a different size. So basically if the column, if column is equal to grid box, grid size, then we want to actually change it back to 1, because then we're going to be starting a new row. And we are going to also add 1 to our row. So we go through each one, we reach the end, then column equals 1, but row equals 2, etc., etc. And else, only in the case where it's not the last column will we add column plus plus. So let's format our code. Okay, great. So we have this, these rows and these columns. And basically what we want to do is say, let ID equal row column. So now we have an array, it's called ID, and basically it has the number of the row and the number of the column. And then we are going to pass it into our new constructor. And in order to use this information now, we will put this parameter in our constructor, this argument in our constructor as well. And we can define, let's say, this dot ID equals, and we're going to want this to be a string because we are going to want to, it'll just make it a little easier to work with. And basically this ID property is the ID that you'll also see for the HTML attribute. And you'll see that in a moment. So in order to create the string, we're going to use template literal. And we're just going to make it very simple. So it'll just be we need this. So let's say ID 0 dash ID 1. Because remember, ID is an array. And basically that means that the ID of each box will just be row dash column. So let's run our code, and I'm going to inspect the code again. And if we take a look at our boxes, so you'll see that each one has an ID. And 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7, 1, 9, 10. And then after 10, it comes 2. And you can see as I follow along with each one that it is in the correct place in our entire grid. So now with that done, we can basically place our Karel in a certain place and identify that place using its ID. Identify that box using the ID. So when we place Karel, basically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to find the box that has the row and the column that we specify as its ID. So what we could say here is const, and I'm just going to call this start box, okay, and it's going to be equal to document dot get element by ID, and the ID will be we're going to use template literal here again. It'll be row dash column. Excellent. And then what we will do is start box dot append this. Okay, this again is Karel. Okay, so let's run the code. And here on the bottom, okay, so we created a new Karel, we have Karel's direction, and we appended here to grid. But what we want to do now is we want to try out our new place method. Okay, so I use Karel.place, and let's say I say 4, 5, and we run our code. You can see Karel was placed at 4, 5. Okay, I say 7, 9, and row 7, column 9. Now let's say I want to test 2 edge cases and show you why we're not done yet. Okay, so let's say for starters that we don't give anything here in this Karel.place. Okay, so I run our code, boom, we have an error. Okay, so that's one situation that we want to deal with. Another one is, let's say I say 11, 20, okay, and then I run our code, boom, we have another error. Okay, so we have 2 edge cases. One is that if we don't pass on parameters to the place function, and the second is if we pass on parameters that are not a fit, if they're bigger than our grid box, or our grid size. Okay, so in order to deal with that, we are going to have to add some more things to our place function. So first of all, let's say if the row is bigger than grid size, okay, or if column is bigger than grid size, okay, then we will return. Okay, that means we're going to exit this. So nothing is going to happen, but at least we're not going to throw an error. Okay, and the second edge case, because we really don't know where to put him. Okay, if they gave us 2 very large numbers, we don't know where to put them. So we're just not going to put them anywhere, and they're going to have to figure it out. We could also add an error message in the console, or we can add some other kind of something in the user interface which indicates that there was an error, and we can deal with that later, but for now this will deal with that edge case. And the other case that I want to deal with is if we don't have any row or column at all. Okay, so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that start point, okay, let's call it, or let's call it start location, because we've been using the location word, the location keyword. So start location will be, okay, and here we're going to say row and column. Okay, and basically that means is that if row is not undefined and column is not undefined, then it's going to be equal to this. Okay, but in the case where either row or column is undefined, so that means if we only gave one parameter, or if we didn't give any parameters at all, then we are just going to put it at 1, 1. Okay, because that's a likely situation that we want to be at 1, 1 if we didn't give it any kind of parameters, and it's also going to help us use this place function, this place method later on in a convenient way. Okay, and then basically here, instead of passing on this, what we had before, we're going to pass on start location to our start box in order to give it an ID. So let's run our code again. And now you can see that even though I'm placing it at 1120, we don't get any error. And if I was to erase both of these and just call the place method empty, then he'll be placed in 1, 1. Okay, so this is great. And the last thing that we're going to do in this part of the tutorial is keep a log of where Karel is, because that's very important information for us. And it's going to help us move him and manipulate him in different ways. So in order to do that, let's create, this is the grid box. Inside of Karel, okay, we want to basically create this dot location. Okay, and when we initialize this location, we're going to start it off as at 1, 1, because that's where Karel is usually going to start. And basically, when we place Karel, okay, so we will say that this dot location will be equal to row column. Okay, and that seems okay. So let's run the code, and then let's say we place Karel at 5, 5, and then I log console.log Karel.location. And we run the code, and it tells me that Karel is at 5, 5. But let's say we give this an empty, we don't pass any parameters. So run the code, then we get null, null. But actually what we want here is 1, 1, right? So we need to create a similar condition here, okay, when we're defining the location, and say that if both of them exist, then we will pass on row column, but if not, then we will pass on an array with 1, 1. Okay, and now we can run our code again, and you'll see here that we got 1, 1 instead of null, null. So that was the beginning of our Karel tutorial. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you will get a notification about our future videos. So we hope to see you next time.